so many different types of batteries, and it seems like we're getting a new one all the time. With all of these papers, articles, videos, it can be super confusing to figure out which one of these batteries is actually worth all the hype. There are 3 battery chemistries that maybe you haven't heard of that I want to try to break down for you today to explain what they are, why they're different, and what the future might look like. So the 3 that I want to focus on are LFP, NCA, and sodium ion. With that, let's dive into it. The first thing that you need to understand about the battery industry is that lithium-ion batteries are the standard.
Lithium supply.
White gold.
Lithium ion battery.
Lithium ion battery.
Everyone loves lithium batteries. And the reason for that is because they're some of the most energy dense and most high power batteries that we have. So 2 of the battery chemistries that I'm going to be talking to you about today are a type of lithium-ion battery. And lithium-ion batteries essentially have this overarching framework, so like graphite anode, lithium ions are charge carriers, but the thing that's different about them is the cathode material. So the cathode is your positive electrode, and what your cathode is made of determines what type of lithium-ion battery that you have. One more thing I want to point out before we dive deep into the chemistry of batteries here is that the battery you choose and the parameters that you prioritize are going to depend a lot on the application you want to use this battery for. So say you need a really high powered battery for something like a research application. Their cost isn't going to matter quite as much because you're more focused on performance. But in something like an EV, where it's a lot more consumer based, you're going to need to prioritize the cost a bit more. So those 2 applications would have very different battery choices. First up, we have NCA batteries. So this is essentially nickel, cobalt, aluminum batteries. And what this means is that the cathode is made up of lithium, nickel, cobalt, aluminum oxide, which is a mouthful, so just call it NCA. So these batteries are very similar to NMC batteries, which are the ones that are likely in your phone and in your EV. But the way that they differ is they use a lot less cobalt and nickel. And this is good because cobalt and nickel require a lot of intensive mining practices, which can be potentially unethical or potentially very environmentally damaging. Plus, nickel and cobalt are quite rare, so we generally want to stick away from materials that could potentially run out. So these have the potential to be used in things like consumer electronics and EVs instead of these cobalt-heavy batteries because they have a really high energy density. And if you're curious, this is what the cathode looks like. Next up, we have LFP batteries, or lithium iron phosphate. So in the cathode here, it's actually not too confusing. It's just lithium, iron, and phosphate. So it looks like this if you're curious. The interesting thing about lithium iron phosphate batteries is that they're actually a lot cheaper than any other type of lithium ion battery. And that's because they don't use nickel and cobalt, and they use a lot more iron. So they're not using the expensive materials, but they're using the cheaper ones. The other thing about LFP is they're a lot safer, and that's because the iron is not as reactive, so the battery has less of a chance of exploding, aka thermal runaway, which is great, and it makes it really attractive for things like grid storage, where you definitely do not want your battery to fail. Because the iron is not quite as reactive though, the battery actually has a lower energy density, and that's why it's not really used in things like cell phones or EVs, something where you need a really high power application. So that's why LFP is, like I mentioned, a lot better for grid scale storage. And the other really interesting thing about LFP is that they can last a lot longer than other types of batteries. So they can last under optimal conditions about 10,000 cycles, which is insane. And on average, they last around 3,000 cycles. But compare it to NCA batteries, which we just talked about, those will only last about 500 to 1,000. So that is a pretty big increase. The last type of battery that I want to talk to you about today is sodium ion batteries. So these are not a type of lithium ion battery, but they work in very much the same way, in that it's ions that are doing the charge movement. So in a sodium ion battery, obviously it's not lithium ions, it's sodium ions that are carrying the charge. But the thing that gets people so excited about sodium ion batteries is that they are way cheaper than lithium ion batteries. A lithium ion battery will cost from $115 to $151 US per kilowatt hour, depending on the specific chemistry. But a sodium ion battery costs about $87 US per kilowatt hour, which is a huge jump, especially when you consider that sodium ion battery technology isn't even that developed. The main reason for this gap in cost is that lithium itself is very expensive because even though it's fairly abundant, to process it to the level of purity that we need for batteries is very expensive and time consuming. Meanwhile, with sodium, it's even more abundant than lithium, and extracting it from the ground isn't that complicated of a process compared to lithium. Sodium ion batteries are also generally safer. because it's not quite as reactive as lithium due to periodic trends, there's not that same risk of explosion. The downside of this though is that, as with LFP batteries, sodium ion batteries have a lower voltage, which means that they potentially aren't that great for high power applications like EVs and consumer electronics, and they have more potential, like LFPs, in grid scale storage. The final thing that I want to point out here though is that sodium ion batteries actually have the potential to be the same level of energy density as lithium ion batteries. The reason they're not right now is because the technology is not there. Sodium ion battery technology is about where lithium ion battery technology was 10 years ago. And that's because not that many people are working on it, and it's also still fairly new. So I'm excited to see where this goes, and I know a lot of other people are as well. So those are 3 of the battery chemistries that I think have a lot of potential for the future that maybe you've never heard of, but now you hopefully know a bit about. So I really do hope that you've learned something, and thank you so much for watching. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.